Well, hello, friends. I recently left pretty much everybody hanging by giving just a little bit of information. Recently, we were talking about the 400 silent years, and you may remember that. The fact is this: I just love understanding the Bible in light of history and some of the events that surround what were going on during the times of the Bible. And there's so many different lessons that we can learn. And so, when it came to studying for the 400 silent years, there's a lot of lessons I was able to learn. And there's a lot of things I wish I could have said in the recent sermon that I addressed it, but I figured I'd just share one lesson with you if I could. And so, if you just entertain me just for a moment to listen and kind of think about this interesting thought. Now, I'm going to mention a few things, and then I'm going to try to tie it all together at the very end. And I think this will be pretty cool and be able to help you understand this one thought. If I can really help you to put it together, thinking about the 400 silent years, that's the years between the book of Malachi, the book of Matthew, if you will. The Old Testament ends, you turn the page, that 400 years there before the New Testament starts up. And I want to just share just a really, really cool thought to help you to understand something that's really neat that'll help you to find peace in the world. But you can't really find peace in the world without having this, because you really find peace in the Word. Now, let me explain that. You'll catch on to that in just a second. So, how do we find peace in the world? Through the Word, okay? We think about that, and this is what's really neat, is because we know that the world, in a sense, has a semblance of peace right now. In fact, in those days when Jesus was born, there was a semblance of peace, the Pax Romana, if you will. It was a time of peace, but there's wasn't a whole lot of peace that was going on completely, if you will, because it was the days of the Roman Empire. And then we think about what's going on today. There's a lot of things going on. Like, we say there's international peace overall, but there's a lot of things that are underlying tensions. We think about worldwide disease. We think about political tensions that are going on. And let's just be frank, on the inside of us, every day, we face different challenges and struggles on an individual and a personal level. And sometimes there's just not peace on the inside. So, how do we find peace? Well, again, as I mentioned, during that 400 years, there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about. And I'm just going to isolate just a few of those thoughts and then tie them together and really help you to find how to get the peace that God wants us to have. Okay, now, this may sound a little bit weird, but I'm going to mention this to you. During that period of time in the 400 years, guess who was around? You probably remember them from history, but there were three guys. Notably, there was other ones too, but the philosophers, if you will. By the way, you can remember them if you have a history test coming up sometime soon. You can remember them like the Roman spas, okay? And they're in that order: Spa, Socrates, and then Plato, and then Aristotle. So you think about these guys, and they were alive around the time of Malachi, about 400 BC. So think about that just for a moment. We think of Socrates, and maybe you had a teacher, one of my favorite teachers in school. He liked to use the Socratic method of teaching. He would always ask questions and have a lot of banter with the students and stuff. One of my favorite teachers. After him came a guy named Plato. And like every kid grows up with Plato, right? Now, that's not what I'm talking about, okay, when it comes to Plato. But when it comes to the philosopher Plato, after him came the guy that starts with A, and he is Aristotle. Now, we think about Aristotle, he developed this idea through a philosophy. And by the way, he was not a believer in the Lord like we are, but he came up with a philosophical idea that essentially the concept or the idea of God, he is the unmoved mover, is how he would have defined him, meaning that everything is caused by something that ultimately traces back to something or someone who started it. It's kind of like the idea that we think there's a cause and an effect. And he rationalized through that and kind of came up with this philosophy for God, if you will. Well, from this idea, we know that the Greeks created what became to be known in their language the word logos. You say logos, that kind of sounds familiar, and it may sound familiar to you. That word logos is translated as the word word. And we think about that. We're going to see that in just a little bit. We think about that word word because the New Testament is translated from the Greek language. Every time you see that word word, guess what the word is behind it? It's that Greek word logos. Now, we think about the word, I'm using words right now, but that word also takes on the semblance of communication I want to describe to you in just a moment. So hold on to that one thought about the word representing this idea of the referencing and pointing to God. Now, I want to remind you too, Aristotle, who was one of his best students. You may remember it was Alexander the Great, right? And recently, when I was preaching and sharing about the study of the 400 silent years, you remember how it was that Alexander the Great, he conquered the known world, and he was coming into Jerusalem, and there was a priest who laid out the scroll of the book of Daniel. And the priest showed Alexander the Great how it was that Daniel had written in that scroll about and prophesied that Alexander the Great was going to conquer the world. And so, because of that, Alexander the Great spared that priest's life. Now, very interestingly, I think one of the things that really resonated with Alexander the Great through that time is the very fact that, well, Daniel wrote, and he was writing a prophecy about the fact that God created, he caused these events to happen. And who was Alexander the Great? An understudy of Aristotle who believed and taught this philosophy that helped him to understand what the word is, if you will. Now, I want to kind of move on from that and point out this next idea. Think about jumping them from the early on part, Malachi, the three philosophers, especially Aristotle, and then go 400 years later, and we ask this question: when Jesus was born, who was there? Well, there was a lady that was there, and she was about 84 years of age. And sorry, she was a widow for 84 years, and she was serving in the temple. She was there evening and morning, and her father is mentioned in the Bible. And by the way, he is the first link that we see in the New Testament that is a picture or a connection with the 400 silent years. Her father and Anna were living, and they were alive when a different Alexander was king. So Alexander the Great, he was in the Greek Empire. Later on, eventually the Roman Empire is going to come, and that's who was in power when Jesus was born. But in between that time, in Israel, what happened is there was a revolt, and the Maccabees, you may remember that story, they came in and they tried to establish Israelite rule, and they did for about 100, 150 years, something like that, in Israel. It's really, really cool to be able to see. But one of the kings that they had, he was a Maccabean king, and we think about what was going on in Israel. We know in the New Testament there was the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right? Well, just to let you know a little bit about how bad things were getting in Israel during this time, the Sadducees and the Pharisees did not get along. In fact, this Alexander, not Alexander the Great, but the Alexander that was the king of Israel, if you will, at this point in time, he took up with the Sadducees. The Sadducees, we talked about this, they were sad because they didn't believe in the resurrection, but the Pharisees did. But the Pharisees were ruthless in the fact that they created all kinds of rules and they put pressure on the people. So we think about who it was, this Alexander, he took it with the Sadducees, and also when it came to the Sadducees, they also partnered with the priests overall. And thinking about this king, I believe it was during one of the ceremonies, he was supposed to pour a cup of water on the altar, but he actually poured it out on the ground, and it caused a mighty revolt with the Pharisees because when he poured it on the ground, he was actually not going against Jewish law like the Mosaic law, but he was actually rebelling against the Pharisaical law. And because of that, it caused a revolt and a battle between the Sadducees and the Pharisees and under the king. And I think like 6,000 people died. Ultimately, because of the extended battle, there was like 50,000 people in this battle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. 50,000 people died. Can you imagine that? Now think, that is the foundation of the tension between the Sadducees and the Pharisees when Jesus comes on the scene. They don't like each other. So it's really interesting to be able to see that. It's another foundational thing that we learn in the time of the 400 silent years. Now, kind of moving on from that, we think about this period of time, what was going on. Anna, she was at the end of this 400 years. Her father and she were alive during this time that King Alexander was there in Israel. And now she has been a widow. She probably got married, probably about when she was 14. Her husband died when she was about 21. And now for 84 years-ish, she's been a widow So in her early 100s, I guess you could say, she was pretty old. And when it came to this, she was worshiping God. And a long time later, we can see that while she's worshiping God, she's there in the temple, and guess who came? It's the time of the Pax Romana, yes, but think about it, in the Roman world, there was a semblance of peace, but it really wasn't peaceful. I want you to think about this. In the Roman Empire, do you know 5 out of 7 people were most likely slaves? So most of the population of people who were living in the Roman world were not free citizens, they were slaves. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of peace. So, thinking about this, when Mary and Joseph finally brought Jesus and presented him in the temple, guess who was there? We talked about this, Anna. And she was alive during that time, the 400 silent years. She's a very old woman. Let's say she's like 105 years old, okay, 105. And think about this. In Luke 2:38, here's what it says of her. It says, she gave thanks unto the Lord, and then it says, and spake of him to all them that looked for redemption in Israel. So we kind of think about that when it comes to reminding ourselves about who Jesus is. Where did redemption come from? Well, it comes from God's plan, right? His divine cause, and he is the divine word. You say, where does that come up? Well, Aristotle breathed meaning into God's plan. We think about the word that the Greeks used, where Aristotle came up with the concept and the idea. And if you will, he kind of breathed that idea, and God utilized that word in the English or in the Greek language to be able to be communicated then to describe the very coming of Jesus in John 1:1. Do you remember what it says? It says there, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Isn't that a powerful thing? So we start to think about that 400 silent years, and there's so many connected ideas, so many connected people, believers as well as unbelievers, that God connected together to create the concept that we see in the New Testament as far as Jesus coming and him being the living word. And praise the Lord for this, he brings peace and help in our lives. So as you wrap your head around all the challenges that you're facing in the world, remember that in the midst of everything that's going on, God has given you his word. Who is that? His divine cause. We understand that God started everything. We understand that God has a plan that he provided through Jesus Christ, and he is the one who causes us to be able to have an opportunity of salvation and fulfillment and peace in him. So know this. You may be facing whatever, fill in the blank. We all do. It may be a different name, a different face, a different situation, but here's where we're at. God has a purpose that he is fulfilling in your life, and it is not for naught. So I want to encourage you, turn to Jesus Christ and find peace in him. Hey, I want to remind you this. If there's a spiritual need that you have, if I can help you somehow, please let me know. You can always reach out to me. Many people know me. You may have different contact information. If you're kind of new to connecting with me, just reach out. Pastor@opendooronline.com is a pretty simple way to do it. And if you think that maybe this will be an encouragement to somebody else, share it with them as well. I'm certainly grateful for what God's doing through our church family and what he's doing with our church family at Open Door Baptist Church. And I want to encourage you to visit online at opendooronline.com. And then I want to encourage you, if you're available in our community, in our area, or just stopping by, come in for a service. But thank you for watching, and God bless. Let's find peace in the Word, which is Jesus Christ.